Hello everyone, welcome back to Study Room. So, in this video, we are going to learn more in detail about friction, the advantages and disadvantages of friction and friction in fluids. So, firstly, friction is it a boon or a bane? Firstly, we understand the meaning of what is boon. Boon is something which is very beneficial or helpful. So, in what ways can the friction be beneficial or helpful? Or it is a bane. Now, what is the meaning of bane? Bane literally means that something which ruins, that is, something which is not useful. Not useful. So let's see in what ways the friction can be a boon, that is, how can it be beneficial, and in what ways it can be a bane, that means something which is not useful. Moving on. Now, is friction good or bad? That means what advantages does it have or what disadvantages does it have? So, have you seen a coin? A coin always have two sides. Similarly, friction also has two sides. One is very essential, one where it is very essential and very important. And in some things, it is undesirable. We don't want it. So now consider that there is a wet floor and you try walking on it. What happens then? There are higher chances that you will slip on that wet floor. So, a friction is required for you to enable to walk on the ground properly. On the other hand, due to friction, wheels of motor vehicles and moving parts in several machines wear out over time. That means there is a certain kind of disadvantage of friction happening in the case of automobiles, that is, motor vehicles. Now, moving on, what is the good side of friction now? There are many hundreds of practical life examples in which a friction is a boon. That is it proves to be very useful. Now, it is because of friction that we are able to hold the glass, earthen pots, ice cubes in our hand. Now, ice cubes definitely has a very smooth surface. So, what makes us or what enables us to hold the ice cubes in our hand? The force of friction enables us to hold the ice cubes in our hand. Now, friction between the pencil tip and paper rubs off particles from the tip, which then sticks to the papers, which enables us to write on the paper. Simple enough. Now, let's move on. Now, what are the other examples? Let's have a look at some other examples. Without enough friction between tires of automobiles and ground, they can't move or change the direction, or they can't even be stopped. That means brakes cannot be applied. It is because of friction that the brakes that we are able to apply brakes, right? Simple enough. Now, matchsticks. What enables the matchstick to light? It is because of the force of friction present between the matchstick and the matchbox that produces heat, and this heat is produced because of force of friction. This is the use of force of friction. Now, moving on, let's have a look at what are the disadvantages. That means what is the bad side of force of friction. Now, have you ever wondered why the sole of your footwear, the tires of automobiles, wear out over time? You must have often come across that. Now, this is because of force of friction. Due to friction, what happens that between the moving parts in machine, useful energy which is very important, it is wasted out as heat. Now, because heat is released, the temperature of the device or the automobile rises, and therefore we have to install some kind of cooling system to maintain the device health. That is, we install air conditioners, right? Now, tires of vehicles running at high speed for a long period of time experience excessive heating and wearing out due to friction, that is because of friction, sometimes leading to tire blasts and accidents. Sometimes due to more force of friction, it may lead to tire blasts and accidents. So in this case, friction has a bad side. Now, what can happen is that according to our convenience, we can either increase or reduce the friction, and that is basically to meet our needs, right? So let's see how does it happen. Firstly, how can we increase the friction? Now, you must have often come across, if you wear sports shoes or if you are a footballer, then what you will find that there are spikes on the surface, on the sole of your football shoes. Now, why do they put such spikes on the sole of your football shoes? It is because if you put the spikes on the football shoes, the force of friction increases and you have a more better grip, a better control, while minimizing the chances of slipping. So, the sole of footwear, the tires of automobile are grooved to increase the friction with the ground. This provides better grip and control, which are very necessary. Now, moving on. Let's see another examples of increasing frictions. Now you must have often seen that the kabaddi players, they take the mud from the ground, they rub it on their hands. Why do they do this? Because if they rub the mud on their hand, the force of friction increases and they have a better grip. So kabaddi players, gymnasts, tennis players apply some coarse powder on their hand to increase the grip. The brake pads of bicycles, motorcycles press against the tire when the brakes are pressed. This causes a friction force to act on the tire and thus stop it. So when we apply the brakes, a force of friction is directly acted on the tire and thus eventually it stops it, right? Now let's see how can we reduce friction for our advantage. Now you must have definitely played a game of carom. What happens that during the start of the game we sprinkle some fine powder to make the surface smooth, that is to reduce the friction, right? Now grease, oil or graphite are applied to the surfaces of moving parts in machines to reduce friction. Because of the use of oil or grease, the surface becomes smooth. The surface becomes smooth and thus the force of friction reduces. Now remember how grease oil is put on a cycle chain. You must obviously be riding a cycle. So you must have observed again and again you have to put grease or oil on your cycle chain. Why do you do this? You do this to reduce friction so it does not wear out over time. Now wheels, ball bearings and similar structures are used in moving parts to reduce friction. Right? It is simple enough. Now let's continue. Now, in all these examples, we saw that often there was a use of oil or grease to reduce friction. Now let's see how does this oil reduce the friction actually. Now oil is up when oil, grease or graphite is applied to the surface of a moving part, it forms a thin layer on the surface, restricting direct interlocking of the moving parts. Now what happens that this is moving part 1, this is moving part 2. Now what happens here that if we apply any kind of oil or grease here, a thin layer is formed. See, this is the thin layer, right? This is a thin layer. And because the formation of this thin layer, the direct interlocking of the moving part is reduced, right? So because of this reduction of direct interlocking, the force of friction also increases and it also decreases, and it decreases to a great extent, right? So these substances which reduce friction are called lubricants. So what are the types of lubricants that we saw? The types of lubricants are oil, grease, or graphite. Right? Understood? Now let's move on. Now, how wheels reduce friction. Now, it is always easier to roll than to slide a body over one another. So, when a wheel rolls over a surface, neither sliding friction nor static friction acts on it. Now, let's recollect what was sliding friction and static friction. Static friction was the force of friction when the body is at rest, and sliding friction was the friction when the body was in motion. So, what happens in the case of wheels is that this is a special case, and the friction acting here is quite small as compared to the sliding friction. The reason for this will be studied in higher standard. You will learn the reason for this in higher standards. But for now, this type of friction present in wheels is called rolling friction. Understood? Let's move on. Now we'll study about the friction in fluids. We already saw about how it works in solid. Now let's have a look how does it work in liquids and gases. So remember how we constrained our imagination only to solid matter in the beginning. It helped us to understand and visualize friction well. Now in science, gases and liquids are collectively called fluids. Now, these fluids also exert a force of friction on objects moving through them. Even gases and liquids have a force of friction. A force of friction is always present. So now, what is fluid friction exactly? Now, what do? You try moving your hand through a bucket filled with water. You will always feel some kind of resistance, some kind of obstruction. Now, remember when you go on a scooter or a bike ride with someone, air feels rushing through you. Now, air, water, and other gases and liquids exert the force of friction when objects move through them. And this particular frictional force exerted by the fluids is called drag. It has a specific term for it, and it is called a drag. This force on the object depends upon its speed with respect to the fluid, the shape of the object, and the nature of the fluid. Right? Now, to move through a fluid, objects have to overcome this drag force, and this, like friction among solids, involve loss of energy. Now, whenever there is a force of friction, whenever there is a friction present, to overcome this friction, a force is always required, and for that, some kind of energy is always needed. The shape of the object plays a very important role in drag force, that is the frictional force in liquids and gases. Now, have you ever wondered why do airplanes are pointed at the start, and why do they have that kind of shape at the end, and why birds and fishes are of the shape they are? It is because that the shape of the object plays an important role in drag force, right? Now let's revise what did we study in this chapter. So firstly, friction opposes the relative motion between the two surfaces in contact. It acts on both the surfaces. The force of friction always acts in opposite direction of the applied force. Now, friction depends on the nature of surfaces in contact. For a given pair of surface, friction depends upon the state of smoothness of those surfaces. Friction depends on how hard the two surfaces press together. Now, static friction comes into play when we try to move an object at rest. That is, static friction is related to the object at rest. And sliding friction comes into play when the object is sliding over one another. That is when it is in motion. Right? Now, sliding friction is always smaller than the static friction. Now, friction is important for many of our activities. Friction can be increased by making a surface rough. We already saw that in the examples of shoes. The sole of the shoes and the tires of the vehicle are traded to increase the friction. Friction is sometimes undesirable as well. Friction can be reduced by the lubricants. Now, what were the types of lubricants? Yes, it was oil, grease, and graphite. Now, when a body rolls over another body, rolling friction comes into play. Rolling friction is smaller than sliding friction, it is minimal. In many machines, friction is reduced by using ball bearings. Now, fluid friction can be minimized by giving suitable shapes to the bodies moving in the fluids, as we saw in the example of the airplane and the birds. Right? Simple enough. So this was all for today's video. In this chapter of friction, we learned about what is friction, what are the factors affecting the friction, what are the types of friction, what are the advantages and disadvantages of friction. Is friction a boon or a bane? Right? How is friction present in fluids? Right? So we will connect next time at study room. Till then, thank you and take care. So this was all for this chapter. We learned about friction, what are the factors affecting the friction, what are the types of friction, what are the advantages and disadvantages of friction, like if friction is a boon or a bane. How can friction be acting on fluids? So I hope you all understood what is friction and the details about the friction. We will connect now next time at study room. Till then, thank you and take care.